The judge hit the nail on the head when sentencing Khaki. She called FGM a barbaric practice and a serious crime. I mean, when we have to spell out that mutilating a young girl is barbaric, you know that the moral compass of the liberal establishment has been utterly smashed to bits, and that conservative leadership contender Kemi Badenoch has a total point to make when she argues that not all cultures are equally valid when it comes to immigration. This is Emad Kaky, a former PhD student, a man who lived among us, studied in our universities, and was hailed as one of those so-called skilled migrants we apparently need to keep our country running and actually to protect the liberal establishment from the views of us Brexit voting gammons. But behind that intellectual facade, with Khaki, lurked something much darker. Khaki wasn't plotting to cure diseases or advance knowledge most recently. Nope, he was conspiring to mutilate a young girl, subjecting her to the horrors of female genital mutilation and forcing her into marriage as a young girl. Think about that for a second. In Britain, in 2024, a man like Khaki thought he could get away with a barbaric crime that has no place in a civilised society. I assume that once she was married, she'd probably bring someone over too when she's old enough. So the next time you hear the soft cooing of multicultural apologists reminding us how we need to be more intelligent with our migrants, just remember Emad Kaky and what he actually stood for. Multiculturalism, we're consistently told, is the bedrock of a modern, diverse Britain. You know the old line by now, I'm sure you do. The same old narrative about how we need migration to fill the NHS with doctors, nurses, and those intellectual elites, the enlightened minds to lead us forward. But what happens when the so-called enlightened among us, like a former PhD student no less, are exposed for plotting the most barbaric medieval atrocities? It blows apart the fairy tale we've been force-fed for years, doesn't it? Like a goose with one of those pipes stuck down its throat for foie gras, getting fat on delusion. Let's be absolutely clear. This case, it's the first time someone's been convicted in this country of conspiracy to commit FGM. And what makes it even more outrageous is that this vile plan was orchestrated by a man benefiting from our education system, living among us, presumably hailed as one of those skilled migrants that we so desperately need. So the next time you hear that, about migration being the lifeblood of Britain, maybe you ought to actually question whether actually it's just extracting the blood of Britons. The judge hit the nail on the head when sentencing Khaki. She called FGM a barbaric practice and a serious crime. I mean, when we have to spell out that mutilating a young girl is barbaric, you know that the moral compass of the liberal establishment has been utterly smashed to bits, and that conservative leadership contender Kemi Badenoch has a total point to make when she argues that not all cultures are equally valid when it comes to immigration. But what's even more telling is that the so-called cultural pressure that was cited in this case, you ask yourself, what do they mean? Culture, why is that a factor in a British court? We've bent over backwards to accommodate every culture under the sun, but where exactly is the line drawn? Is it meant to be our problem? It's time that we had a serious, no-nonsense conversation about multiculturalism, and this case should be one of those that we think of. If we can't safeguard vulnerable girls from this kind of savagery, what are we really doing? We need less tiptoeing about sensitive cultural issues and actually focusing on what British justice just delivered here, real consequences. I mean, 4.5 years behind bars for this fella doesn't actually feel like it does enough, given the horrors that he had in store for this girl, but it's a start. The question you have to ask as well, how many more cases like this are actually waiting in the wings here in Britain? The liberal elites love to tell us that the world is a wonderful multicultural utopia and Britain is its very foundation. But let's be honest, shall we? When so-called cultural practices include hacking at the genitals of young girls, maybe it's time to start questioning what's being imported along with the skills that they keep harping on about. For far too long, this country has avoided uncomfortable truths, led to the grooming gangs. But if multiculturalism means tolerating this level of depravity, the rape of young girls, the cutting of young girls, the marriage to men of young girls, well, you can absolutely count me out. It's time for Britain to wake up, to get tough. We've got to stop making excuses and start protecting the vulnerable. Have you got what it takes to be a reasoned presenter? Well, send us a short clip of yourself to join@reasoned.uk and we might be seeing you on this very channel very soon indeed.